The early settlement of Greece dates back far into the Neolithic period, and thus forms the deepest historical foundation for the long and multifaceted history of the country. As early as around 7000 BC, that is, more than 9,000 years ago, the first permanent settlements can be traced on the territory of present-day Greece. Particularly fertile Thessaly played an outstanding role in this. In this region, which is traversed by rivers such as the Pineos and framed by gentle ranges of hills, ideal conditions were found for the early farmers, who here for the first time became sedentary. This development was part of a much larger movement of the Neolithic Revolution, which encompassed large parts of the so-called Fertile Crescent. By this term is meant the crescent-shaped region that stretches from Mesopotamia across Syria and Palestine to Anatolia, and in which agriculture and animal husbandry spread for the first time in human history. Although Greece lay on the edge of this zone, its geographical proximity to Anatolia, where settlements such as Çatalhöyük flourished very early, favored the influx of new ways of life and economic practices. Through sea and land routes, domesticated plants and animals reached Greece, as well as the techniques of agriculture and animal husbandry. The people who settled in Thessaly and later in other parts of Greece brought with them a profound change. Instead of wandering around as hunters and gatherers, they began to cultivate fields and keep animals such as sheep, goats, and cattle. Thus, not only did food security grow, but the first permanent village communities also emerged. Archaeological finds prove that these early settlers lived in clay houses, used tools made of polished stone, and produced simple ceramics that served both for storage and for cooking. Particularly impressive is how social structures already seem to have begun to form in these Neolithic communities. The settlements often consisted of several houses arranged in loose groups, which indicates family or clan-like associations. Traces of community-used areas were found, possibly for feasts or ritual acts, which in turn point to the first forms of social cohesion and collective identities. Burial finds from this time also provide indications that certain members of the community may have held a prominent position. In addition to Thessaly, other early centers of settlement can be traced in Macedonia and on the Peloponnese. From here, the Neolithic way of life spread over the following millennia across the entire Greek mainland and the Aegean. A true cultural landscape emerged, characterized by small villages, fields, and pastures. The transition from mere appropriation of nature to conscious shaping of the landscape was a fundamental turning point that prepared the way for all later high cultures. Altogether, this early settlement marks a quiet but extremely significant epoch of Greek history. Even if today only foundations, tools, and shards of pottery remain of these first farmers in their villages, they nevertheless laid the foundation for everything that was to come. Without the decision of these people to remain in one place, to practice agriculture, and to keep animals, Greece would never have developed the more densely populated structures out of which, thousands of years later, polis cultures, philosophers, and great buildings arose. The Neolithic in Greece was thus far more than just a gray process in the distant past. It was the quiet birth of that civilization that was to shape the country in the millennia to come. Cycladic and Minoan culture. With the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, the Aegean entered a new shining epoch. On the Cyclades, a group of islands in the Aegean, and especially on Crete, two fascinating cultures developed, which today are referred to as Cycladic and Minoan. Both stand symbolically for the rise of maritime high cultures, which were characterized by lively seaborne trade, artistic creativity, and a novel way of life. At the same time, they represent the first flowering of that Mediterranean world from which later classical Greece was to emerge. The Cycladic culture, which reached its peak between about 3000 and 2000 BC, unfolded on the small, often barren islands of the Cyclades. Despite their limited resources, the island inhabitants developed a lively exchange with neighbors in Anatolia and on the Greek mainland. They were skillful seafarers who navigated between the islands with slender ships, imported copper, and exported their own products, such as obsidian from the island of Melos. However, the most impressive testimonies of this culture are the small marble statuettes, often stylized female figures with folded arms and a simple, archaic formal language. These artworks, which to this day radiate an almost modern abstraction, bear witness to a highly developed aesthetic sensibility. Around the same time, on Crete, an even more magnificent culture began to emerge, the Minoan. It is named after the legendary king Minos, who in the myths appears as ruler of Knossos and builder of the labyrinth. Around 2000 BC, large palace complexes arose on Crete, above all in Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea, which formed the political and economic center of the island. These palaces were not fortified castles, but open, spacious complexes with many courtyards, storage rooms, and magnificently decorated halls. Particularly famous are the frescoes of Knossos, which show scenes from nature, processions, and the mysterious bull leaping, a sport or ritual in which daring acrobats leapt over the horns of bulls. The Minoan society seems to have been a prosperous, dynamic culture, strongly shaped by the sea. Traders from Crete reached as far as Egypt and the Levant, bringing exotic goods home and in turn exporting fine ceramics and possibly also textiles. These trade connections made Crete a hub of the eastern Mediterranean world. At the same time, the Minoans developed their own form of writing, the so-called linear tablets, which have not yet been definitively deciphered. They testify to an early administration that meticulously recorded supplies, tributes, and trade transactions. In the second half of the second millennium BC, the Minoan culture reached its peak, before it suddenly experienced a dramatic break around 1450 BC. The reasons have not been conclusively clarified to this day. Natural catastrophes, such as the eruption of the volcano on Santorini, Thera, may have played a role. Likewise, the incursion of Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland, who demonstrably soon after took over the palaces. In any case, this marked the end of Minoan dominance in the Aegean. However, their artistic and technical achievements lived on in the subsequent Mycenaean culture. Taken together, the Cycladic and Minoan cultures opened a first great flowering period in the history of Greece. They created a world in which trade, art, and religious rites were closely interwoven, and left behind a rich heritage that still evokes admiration thousands of years later. Above all, the Minoan way of life, their relationship to the sea, and their aesthetics deeply influenced the later development of Greek culture. Thus, these early seafaring and artistic cultures stand at the beginning of a long tradition that repeatedly distinguished Greece as a maritime, open-minded, and creative region. Mycenaean culture. With the rise of the Mycenaean culture between about 1600 and 1100 BC, the history of a first true high culture begins on the Greek mainland, whose testimonies to this day deeply impress. This period marks the transition from smaller local principalities to powerful palace centers that not only ruled over their regions, but also maintained far-reaching connections in the Aegean and beyond. The term Mycenaean derives from the city of Mycenae in Argolis, which was already famous in antiquity for its mighty walls and legendary kings, above all Agamemnon. The Mycenaean world is characterized by imposing fortresses and fortified palaces built high on hills and surrounded by Cyclopean walls made of enormous unworked stones. Besides Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes were especially important centers of this period. Within these complexes lay representative megarons, great throne halls with central hearths, as well as archives, storerooms, and workshops. The architecture bears witness to a strongly hierarchical society, which was able to concentrate resources and manpower in order to erect monumental buildings. Yet the Mycenaean culture was not confined to the mainland. Through their trade contacts, Mycenaean goods reached Crete, Cyprus, Asia Minor, and even as far as Syria and Egypt. Finds of pottery in overseas harbors and references to Mycenaean mercenaries in Egyptian texts prove that the rulers of Mycenae and other centers were part of a wide-reaching network. The Mycenaean elite likely profited from maritime expertise that they had adopted from contact with the Minoans on Crete. In fact, many elements, such as the palace style or aspects of administration, show clear influences of Minoan culture. A key feature of the Mycenaean high culture was the use of linear B script, which was employed primarily for administrative purposes. On thousands of clay tablets, found especially in Pylos and Knossos, records were kept of livestock holdings, grain deliveries, and lists of craftsmen. From this arises the picture of a strongly organized palace system which centrally directed economy, trade, and tribute. Alongside this bureaucratic and military power, however, the Mycenaean world also reveals a rich art and religion. Splendid gold masks, such as the famous so-called Mask of Agamemnon, gold diadems, weapons with inlays, as well as elaborate wall paintings from the palaces, bear witness to a high aesthetic level. The tombs of the upper class, including shaft graves and the monumental Tholos tombs with their immense domes, impressively demonstrate the wealth and funerary cult of this time. Around 1200 BC, however, the Mycenaean order began to collapse. The causes remain unclear to this day. Natural disasters, internal unrest, the so-called Sea People's invasion, or a combination of these factors may have led to the burning of the great palaces and the breakdown of the complex administration. Within only a few decades, the first high culture of the Greek mainland disappeared. Their script fell into oblivion, and the land entered a period later described by historians as the Dark Ages. Yet the legacy of the Mycenaeans endured. Many of the later Greek myths, above all the stories of Troy and the Atreidai, have their historical roots here. In addition, they left behind architectural and artistic impulses that later generations repeatedly took up. Thus, the Mycenaean epic remains a fascinating chapter of Greek history, in which power, art, and long-distance trade combined into an early flourishing, whose ruins and treasures still testify today to the greatness and splendor of that age. Trojan War. The Trojan War, which is placed around the 12th century BC, stands at the threshold between mythological tradition and possible historical reality. Hardly any event has shaped the conception of the early history of Greece as strongly as this legendary conflict. It has been handed down to us above all through the great epics of Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey, which were written down in the 8th century BC but go back to much older orally transmitted stories. This poetry made Troy the epitome of heroic battles, fateful passion, and divine intrigues, and at the same time profoundly shaped the self-understanding of the Greeks. At the core of the narrative lies the war between a coalition of Greek princes led by Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, and the wealthy city of Troy on the coast of Asia Minor. The cause is said to have been the abduction of the beautiful Helen, wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta, who was carried off by Paris, the son of the Trojan king Priam. This insult to honor led the Greeks to gather a huge army in order to conquer Troy and bring Helen back. The Iliad itself depicts only a short episode from the last year of the 10-year war, namely the wrath of Achilles and the dramatic battles around the Trojan walls. Yet from this, there unfolds an entire world of heroes, divine interventions, and tragic destinies. Figures such as Hector, the noble defender of Troy, or Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, became archetypes that radiated far beyond Greek culture. The Odyssey, in turn, tells of the long wanderings of Odysseus after the fall of the city, showing that the after-effects of the war were just as significant as the conflict itself. Archaeologically, the German excavator Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century especially tried to substantiate the legends. On the hill of Hisarlik in present-day Turkey, he discovered the ruins of several superimposed settlements, one of which, generally designated as Troy de Svevnia, chronologically corresponds to the Mycenaean late period and shows signs of violent destruction. Whether this actually represents the historical Troy of the myths is disputed to this day. Yet the parallels are fascinating and have provided further support to the idea of a real Trojan War. Apart from the literary exaggeration, the conflict, if it took place in this form, can also be interpreted as a reflection of that era in which Mycenaean Greeks pursued far-reaching trade interests and political spheres of influence. Troy lay in a strategically favorable position at the entrance to the Dardanelles and thus controlled an important sea route between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Disputes over trade rights, tribute, or political dominance could therefore quite plausibly have escalated into violent confrontations. Be that as it may, the Trojan War developed into a founding myth of Greek culture. It embodied the ideal of the heroic age, in which men acted side by side with gods, personal honor decided life and death, and stories of bravery and tragedy served the Greeks as a collective memory. In later times, the war was repeatedly taken up and reinterpreted by poets, historians, and artists, from the tragedies of Euripides to paintings and operas of modern times. Thus, the Trojan War stands not only for a possible historical conflict in the Late Bronze Age, but above all for a cultural legacy of inestimable significance. It is a key to the landscapes of the Greek soul, to their ideas of glory, fate, and the inevitable workings of the gods. At the same time, it casts light on the tense threshold between myth and history, which makes early Greek antiquity so fascinating and so alive even today. Dark Ages. With the collapse of the Mycenaean palace culture around 1200 BC, Greece entered an epoch that historians often call the Dark Ages. This period, which extended from about 1100 to 800 BC, was marked by profound upheavals and a dramatic loss of cultural and economic complexity. For archaeologists and ancient historians, it long remained a riddle, for the traces it left behind are sparse. It was called dark precisely for this reason, not so much because it was necessarily an age of general darkness, but because our knowledge of it lies in shadow. After the end of the Mycenaean palaces, central elements of this first high culture of the Greek mainland disappeared. The great fortified residences in Mycenae, Pylos, or Tiryns were abandoned or destroyed. With them, the administrative backbone also collapsed. The linear B script, which had been used in the palaces for bookkeeping, was lost. Thus written transmission broke off, and for several centuries, Greece fell back into a time without known written records. Trade, too, which during the Mycenaean epoch had reached far beyond the Aegean as far as Egypt and the Near East, largely came to a halt. Archaeological finds show that the import of luxury goods declined drastically. At the same time, many settlements shrank in size or were completely abandoned. Where once splendid palaces and organized agriculture had prevailed, now smaller, self-sufficient village communities lived, which scarcely maintained any super-regional connections. Yet despite these apparent setbacks, the Dark Ages must not be regarded as merely an age of chaos and decline. In this phase, important social and cultural changes took place, which ultimately prepared the ground for the later flowering of the Greek polis world. A more decentralized social structure emerged, in which local elites and noble families gained greater influence. Social bonds concentrated on family and kinship groups, out of which gradually developed the aristocratic leadership structures of the later city-states. Archaeologically, a change in burial customs can also be observed, whereas in the Mycenaean period, monumental tholos tombs were used to bury rulers. Now, flatter burial mounds or simple pits were preferred. At the same time, the inclusion of weapons in graves increased, which points to a growing importance of the warrior elite. This development was closely connected to the changes in political and social order. At the same time, material culture slowly began to renew itself. In pottery, from the 10th century BC onward, the so-called geometric style appeared, characterized by strict patterns, lines, and later also figural scenes. This art form gradually developed into its own mode of expression, which in the 8th century BC gained formative importance for the self-image of the Greeks. Thus, despite their apparent backwardness, the Dark Ages laid the foundation for the political and cultural diversity of later Greece. The fragmentation of the Mycenaean unitary culture in the long term led to the emergence of a multitude of independent communities, which were to develop into the famous Poleis. Even if this epoch, due to the lack of written records, lies largely in darkness for us, it was by no means only a relapse, but a phase of profound reorientation. Only toward the end of the 9th century, and especially in the 8th century, BC does the picture become clearer again. Greece gradually emerged from the shadows, re-established trade contacts, founded colonies, and finally adopted a new script, the Phoenician alphabet, which was to form the basis of Greek writing and thereby of all European alphabets. Thus, the Dark Ages came to an end and ushered in the classical epoch, which made Greece what it is still famous for today. Origin of the Polis. With the 8th century BC, Greece finally emerged from the Dark Ages and entered a new phase of its history, which was marked by a profound political and social innovation, the emergence of the polis, the Greek city-states. This development was so significant that it shaped the self-conception of the Greeks and their political thought far into antiquity and beyond. The polis became the epitome of Greek life, a complex entity of city and surrounding land, united by a community of free citizens with common rights, duties, and religious cults. The roots of this development lay in the structures that had formed during the Dark Ages, local aristocratic dominions, which ruled over small regions and maintained a strong sense of family and tribal affiliation. In the course of the 8th century, these local centers began to consolidate into more stable communities. The gradual return of trade also played a role, as did the resumption of overseas contacts, which strengthened the economic foundations and thus made possible the emergence of more complex communities. The polis was far more than just an urban settlement. It represented an independent political, social, and religious unit, which often had its own laws, divine cults, and festival calendars. Citizenship, participation in popular assemblies, and the defense of the polis in case of war belonged inseparably together. Each polis developed a strong local identity, reflected in its institutions, its architecture, and its myths. The most famous examples are Athens, Sparta, and Corinth, which already in the 8th and 7th centuries BC emerged as important poleis. Athens gradually developed into a rising commercial and naval power with a political system that in the following centuries increasingly took on democratic features. Sparta, by contrast, organized itself internally as a strictly military society based on discipline and the dominance of a warrior elite. Corinth, in turn, became a center of seaborne trade and itself founded numerous colonies, thereby amassing considerable wealth. The emergence of the polis was closely connected with the growing importance of the hoplite army, a citizen militia of heavily armed infantrymen. The shared battle formation in the phalanx fostered a sense of equality and solidarity among the citizens, which supported the social basis of the polis. At the same time, institutional innovations developed. Offices, councils, and popular assemblies regulated political life and limited the power of individual noble families. This was a fundamental innovation compared to earlier forms of rule, which had mostly been based on personal followings and dynastic structures. Religiously, too, the polis consolidated. Each city had its protective deities, erected temples, and held festivals, which united the citizens in cultic practices. Thus, religion and politics became interwoven in a way that strengthened the sense of community. The city walls that surrounded many poleis made the polis at the same time physically visible and a symbol of the protection and autonomy of its citizens. This new form of organization was to shape the Greek world for centuries. It was the framework in which not only political power, but also art, philosophy, and science unfolded. Rivalry and competition between the polis led on the one hand to conflicts, but on the other hand also to an enormous pressure to innovate, which made possible the cultural achievements of ancient Greece in the first place. The formation of the polis was thus far more than a mere administrative or settlement process. It was a profound social revolution, at the center of which stood the idea of active participation of the citizens in shaping the community. This model was to become one of the most important export articles of Greek culture, and in later times, in modified form, lay the foundation for political orders throughout Europe. Colonization. In the 8th to 6th centuries BC, the Greek world experienced a phase of dynamic expansion, which became known as the period of colonization. In the course of these roughly 2 centuries, the Greek poleis founded hundreds of daughter cities, so-called apoikiai, around the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. This movement was not only an outstanding geographical event, but also a decisive moment of cultural and economic interconnection, which left a lasting mark on the Greek world. The causes of this wave of colonization were manifold. On the one hand, the population in many poleis rose sharply, which overburdened the scarce agricultural land in mountainous Greece. On the other hand, political conflicts within the city-states also played a role, such as struggles between rival aristocratic families, which pressured defeated groups to emigrate. Growing trade likewise provided impulses. The demand for raw materials such as grain, wood, metals, and luxury goods could be better met through establishing their own bases in distant regions. The founding of a colony was a solemn and carefully planned act. Usually under religious guidance, often after consultation of the Oracle of Delphi, Apollos sent out a selected group of settlers. These founded a new city in a strategically or economically promising location, which was politically independent, but often maintained its religious ties and cultural traditions to the mother city. The colony adopted the Poleis model and was likewise organized with an agora, temples, walls, and a political life following the Greek pattern. During this period, the Greeks spread far beyond their original homeland. In the west, so many new cities arose in southern Italy and on Sicily that the region was later called Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Names such as Syracuse, Croton, or Tarentum bear witness to this even today. In the east, the Greeks founded numerous colonies on the coast of Asia Minor as well as on the Black Sea, where places like Byzantion, the later Constantinople, or Sinop flourished. North Africa, too, especially Cyrene in present-day Libya, became a destination for Greek settlers. This expansion had profound economic consequences. The colonies developed into important producers and trading centers for grain, wine, olive oil, and metal goods. At the same time, they secured the supply of the Greek motherland and opened up new markets for its pottery and handicrafts. Yet colonization was also a cultural phenomenon. Across the vast coastal regions of the Mediterranean, Greek language, religion, art, and way of life spread. Sanctuaries, athletic competitions, and the shared sense of a Hellenic identity connected motherland and colonies despite political independence. But colonization was not always peaceful. The newcomers often had to compete with local populations for land and resources. Conflicts with Etruscans, Carthaginians, or Thracian tribes testified to the tensions associated with this expansion. At the same time, trade and cultural contacts also led to lively exchange. The Greeks adopted, among other things, letters from the Phoenician sphere, techniques in shipbuilding, and agricultural innovations. Overall, the colonization of the 8th to 6th centuries BC was a formative driving force for the economic and cultural development of Greece. It created a far-reaching network of trade and cultural centers that laid the foundation for the further flowering of Greek civilization. It also had political consequences. The experiences of the emigrants with self-government and city founding strengthened the Poleis ideal and fostered the consciousness of independence and local identity, which was later to become so characteristic of the Greeks. Thus, this epoch of colonization was not only a time of geographical expansion, but also a phase of intense innovation and identity formation, which led Greece out of its narrow geographical confines and permanently made it one of the defining cultures of the Mediterranean world. Introduction of writing. Around 800 BC, a cultural revolution of hardly overestimable significance took place in Greece. The Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet and adapted it to their own linguistic needs. In doing so, they laid the foundation for Greek writing, which in turn became the mother of all Western alphabetic scripts. This step marked the end of the long scriptless period since the fall of the Mycenaean palaces and ushered in a new epoch of communication, record-keeping, and literary creation. During the Mycenaean period, the Greeks had used a syllabary, the so-called linear B, which was used primarily for economic administration. With the collapse of this palace culture, writing also disappeared from daily life. For several centuries, there followed a phase without written records. Only in the course of the revived trade and the wide-ranging contacts in the Mediterranean world, especially through colonization, did the Greeks once again encounter cultures that possessed writing. The Phoenician alphabet, which went back to a long tradition of Canaanite script cultures, served as a particularly influential model. The Phoenicians, a seafaring people from the region of present-day Lebanon, had developed a consonant script which, because of its simplicity and flexibility, was ideal for trade relations. The Greeks probably first encountered this script through their settlements and trade contacts in the Aegean and in the eastern Mediterranean. Yet they did not merely adopt the Phoenician alphabet, but developed it decisively further. The Greeks added signs for vowels in order to be able to represent their language with its many syllables and sound variations more clearly. Thus arose the first true alphabet in the modern sense, a writing system that represented both consonants and vowels. This made reading and writing considerably easier and opened entirely new possibilities of expression. The oldest testimonies of Greek writing date from the late 8th century BC. Among them is the famous Dipylon inscription on a wine jug from Athens, or the graffiti and geometric script on vases, which come from the context of sanctuaries. Such inscriptions show that writing was at first often used in convivial or cultic contexts to mark prizes for competitions or to formulate dedications to the gods. Subsequently, writing spread rapidly throughout the Greek world and became a fixed component of both public and private life. It made it possible to write down laws and thus fix them bindingly, which was of inestimable value for the young polis culture. It likewise permitted the recording of contracts, genealogical lists, and religious regulations, thereby stabilizing the social structure. Particularly consequential, however, was that writing created a foundation for the emergence of a rich literary tradition. The orally transmitted epics, songs, and stories could now be recorded, which contributed to preserving and spreading works such as Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Later, writing also made possible the development of historiography, philosophy, and science, which began to flourish in Greece from the 6th and 5th centuries BC. Thus, the introduction of writing was far more than a technical detail. It was a cultural quantum leap which not only helped the Greeks to organize their administration and legal systems, but also enabled them to preserve their thoughts, stories, and reflections on the world for posterity. Greek writing thus stands at the beginning of a long tradition that extends through the Latin alphabet to our present-day script culture. It made Greece finally part of that literate world in which ideas, laws, and poetry could outlast time. Homeric Epics. In the 8th century BC, at that time when the Greek world was politically and economically reorganizing itself and writing was reintroduced, two works arose that would shape the self-conception of the Greeks like hardly anything else: Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. These two monumental epics are not only among the oldest literary testimonies of Europe, but also among the most influential. They gave the Greeks shared stories, values, and heroic images, and thus formed a kind of cultural bond that reached far beyond the boundaries of individual poleis. The origin of these poems remains surrounded by a certain mystery to this day. About the historical person Homer, we know nothing for certain. Already in antiquity there was dispute about whether he really existed, whether he was a single poet, or a name for an entire circle of singers. What is clear, however, is that the Iliad and the Odyssey are based on a long tradition of oral transmission, in which wandering aoidoi, singers, performed stories of heroes and gods accompanied by the lyre. The Iliad, in over 10,000 verses, depicts an episode from the last year of the Trojan War, the wrath of Achilles, his withdrawal from the fighting, and the catastrophic consequences for the Greeks. It is an epic of anger, honor, friendship, and death, which at the same time presents a panorama of life and dying on the battlefield. The Odyssey, on the other hand, tells in artfully interwoven stories of the homecoming of the cunning Odysseus to Ithaca, his trials at the hands of gods and monsters, and finally, the restoration of his rule and family. These works were far more than mere entertainment. They offered the Greeks models of heroic behavior, of virtues such as bravery, hospitality, loyalty, and respect for the gods, but also cautionary examples of arrogance and excess. The concept of kleos, the glorious fame that endured beyond death, runs through both epics and reflected a central ideal of the aristocratic world of Greece. Beyond that, the Homeric Epics created a shared memory world. In a time when Greece was politically fragmented into countless poleis, they offered a cultural canon that one could refer to everywhere, whether in Athens, Sparta, or in a small colony in Sicily. The heroes of Troy became common ancestors of an entire civilization that understood itself as Hellenes. In this way, the epics contributed decisively to forming a supralocal Greek identity. With the spread of writing, people soon began to write down and fix these poems. They became study material in the education of young Greeks, served as moral guides, and at the same time were an inexhaustible source for tragedies, speeches, and philosophical discussions. Many generations of Greeks could recite entire passages by heart. The influence of the Homeric imagery reached even into politics. Centuries later, aristocrats still adorned themselves with claims of descent from the heroes of the Iliad. Alongside their social and moral significance, the Homeric Epics are also a linguistic artwork of high rank. Homer's hexametric language, rich in formulas, epic similes, and poetic circumlocutions, formed the foundation of Greek literature. It set standards for poetry that poets such as Hesiod, Pindar, or the tragedians of the 5th century BC adopted and further developed. Thus, the Iliad and the Odyssey became a cultural center of gravity of ancient Greece. They united myth and morality, tradition and identity, and created a kind of collective memory that endured through generations. Even today, they are not only keys to understanding the ancient world, but also living testimonies of that longing for glory, justice, and the eternal struggle between human fate and divine power which so deeply shaped Greek thought. Persian Wars. The Persian Wars, which shook the Greek motherland from 490 to 479 BC, belong to the most dramatic and consequential events of Greek history. They led to an unprecedented closing of ranks of many Poleis in the face of an external threat, and established that historical self-confidence which was to shape classical Greece. The resistance against the all-powerful Persian Empire became a founding narrative of Greek freedom, bravery, and superiority over the Barbaroi, the barbarians of the East. The conflicts had their roots initially in the political circumstances of Asia Minor. There, numerous Greek cities lived, especially on the Ionian coast. They had been subdued by the Persians around 546 BC, and from then on had to pay tribute. The attempt of these cities to free themselves from Persian overlordship in the so-called Ionian Revolt of 499 BC failed, but it drew the motherland into the conflict. Athens and Eretria had supported the revolt, and thus drew upon themselves the wrath of the Persian great king Darius. In 490 BC, a Persian punitive expedition under Datis and Artaphernes landed in Attica. At Marathon came the decisive battle. The Athenians, supported by a small force from Plataea, defeated the Persians in a swift, bold attack despite being outnumbered. The victory at Marathon quickly became a symbol of the courage of free citizens who defended their homeland themselves, while the Persians were portrayed as representatives of a despotic empire. The story of the runner who brought the news of victory to Athens and collapsed dead upon arrival reinforced this heroic image, even if it belongs more to the realm of legend. 10 years later, Xerxes, the son of Darius, undertook a massive campaign of revenge. He led a huge army to which numerous Greek cities submitted, but Athens and Sparta, together with other poleis, organized resistance. The legendary Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC, in which King Leonidas of Sparta with his 300 warriors, supported by other Greeks, halted the Persian advance for a short time, later became the epitome of soldierly willingness to sacrifice. Although the Greeks had to vacate the pass in the end, their courage had an enormous moral effect. The actual turning point came in the naval battle at Salamis in the same year. The Athenians had evacuated their city and stationed their fleet, supported by the Spartan and other allies, in the narrow Strait of Salamis. There they succeeded in destroying the numerically superior Persian fleet in a tactically superior maneuver. Without control of the sea, Xerxes was forced to withdraw with part of his army. The remaining Persian army under Mardonius was finally defeated in 479 BC in the open field battle of Plataea by a pan-Hellenic army. In the same year, the Greeks also destroyed at Mycale in Asia Minor the remnants of the Persian naval power. Thus, the Persian threat was for the time being repelled, the freedom of the Greek Poleis secured. These victories had far-reaching consequences. They not only strengthened the self-confidence of the Greeks, but also cemented the opposition between Hellas and the East, between freedom and servitude, a motif that was repeatedly evoked in tragedies, speeches, and historical works. At the same time, Athens, which through its fleet and determination had played an outstanding role, now began with the establishment of the Delian League. From this and the following decades arose a position of power that ultimately led to conflict with Sparta. But in the immediate aftermath of the Persian Wars, Greece first experienced a time of pride and cultural flourishing. The great victory monuments, including the Serpent Column of Delphi or the monumental new buildings on the Acropolis, are expressions of this newly won self-confidence. The memory of Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea remained for centuries a central component of Greek historical memory and a symbol of the triumph of a free citizenry over the seemingly invincible power of an Oriental empire, the flourishing of Athens. The 5th century BC marks for Athens a time of incomparable cultural, political, and economic development, which is often referred to as the Golden Age. This epoch stood largely under the influence of the statesman Pericles, who succeeded in uniting the forces of Athens and making the city the leading center of the Greek world. Under his leadership, Athens developed into a political and cultural beacon, whose achievements are still regarded today as pinnacles of human civilization. After the Persian Wars, Athens had risen to become the dominant naval power in the Aegean. With the Delian League, originally founded for protection against a Persian return, the city built an extensive alliance system that secured for it political and economic influence. The tributes that the members of the League paid to Athens flowed in large part into the expansion of the fleet, but also into splendid building projects that permanently changed the face of the city. Thus, Athens developed from one polis among many into an almost imperial metropolis. Politically, Athenian democracy experienced its full development in this time. Under Pericles, the political system was shaped so that as many citizens as possible, of course, only male full citizens, could participate in decision-making. Popular assemblies, popular courts, and a multitude of official positions, often filled by lot, guaranteed broad participation. At the same time, poorer citizens also received the possibility of actively taking part in public life through payments for political offices and jury service. This system of isonomia, equality before the law and active citizenship, later became a model for republican ideas far beyond Greece. But the Golden Age of Athens was not only a political phenomenon, but above all a cultural one. Under Pericles began the monumental rebuilding of the Acropolis, which had been destroyed during the Persian Wars. On the citadel arose some of the most famous buildings of humanity: the Parthenon, the temple for the city goddess Athena Parthenos, the Erechtheion with its caryatid porch, and the Propylaea as the magnificent gateway. These buildings were not only religious sites, but also expressions of Athens's self-confidence and artistic ambition. The sculptor Phidias and other masters created works of sculpture of hitherto unmatched grace and dynamism. At the same time, Athens became the center of philosophy, science, and literature. In the streets and colonnades of the city taught thinkers such as Anaxagoras, the sophists, and soon also Socrates, who was to decisively shape the thought of Western philosophy. Likewise, the theater developed into a unique institution that combined art, religion, and politics. The tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, but also the sharp political comedies of Aristophanes, were performed before thousands of citizens in the theater of Dionysus and discussed. This cultural climate, however, was also closely tied to the imperial position of Athens, which increasingly provoked tensions. Many members of the League felt themselves de facto reduced to vassals of Athens. The wealth with which Athens financed its building projects and arts came not least from the coffers of the League, which was already at that time regarded by critics as an abuse. Nevertheless, the flourishing of Athens in the 5th century BC remains one of the most fascinating chapters of world history. Here, democratic participation, economic strength, and an unparalleled artistic and intellectual creativity were united. The ideal images of freedom, civic pride, and beauty that were developed in this epoch extended far beyond the borders of Greece and still shape ideas of politics, art, and culture today. That these achievements should suffer heavy damage only a few decades later in the Peloponnesian War gives the splendor of this time at once a tragic note and underlines its historical uniqueness. Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War, which raged from 431 to 404 BC, was the momentous conflict between the two most powerful Greek states of that time, Athens and Sparta. This war was not only a clash of armies, but a confrontation between two fundamentally different political and social systems. On one side stood democratic maritime Athens with its far-reaching Delian League. On the other, oligarchically organized, militarily oriented Sparta with the Peloponnesian League. The war marked the end of the classical flourishing period of Greece and ushered in an epoch in which no polis could dominate unchallenged. The causes of the conflict lay deep. After the Persian Wars, Athens had continuously expanded its position of power. From the originally defensive alliance against Persia, the Delian League had become something that functioned increasingly like an Athenian empire. Sparta and its Peloponnesian allies viewed this expansion with growing mistrust. Trade conflicts, diplomatic intrigues, and smaller proxy wars intensified the tensions until they finally erupted into open war. The course of the Peloponnesian War was complex and stretched over almost 3 decades, interrupted by fragile phases of peace. Sparta was superior to Athens on land, while Athens used its fleet to plunder Spartan territory and control the sea routes. The famous Athenian statesman Pericles at first relied on a defensive strategy. The rural population withdrew behind the strong walls of Athens, while the fleet secured naval supremacy. But precisely this concentration within the city walls led to disaster when a severe plague broke out that carried off a third of the population, including Pericles himself. In the following years, fortune in war changed hands several times. The Athenians conducted campaigns in northern Greece and eventually dared a reckless undertaking, the Sicilian expedition. It was intended to conquer Syracuse and bring Athens even greater glory and wealth. However, this venture ended in disaster. The Athenian fleet was almost completely destroyed. The troops were killed or taken prisoner. This defeat ushered in the decisive phase of the war. Sparta exploited Athens' weakness and concluded an alliance with its old enemy Persia, which financed the building of a strong Spartan fleet. Thus, the Spartans were eventually able to gain supremacy at sea as well. After a series of naval battles in which Athens lost more and more ships, the city's supply was cut off. In 404 BC, Athens was forced to capitulate. Its walls were torn down, its fleet largely surrendered, and the Athenian democracy was at first replaced by an oligarchic regime, the so-called 30 Tyrants. Although democracy was restored soon thereafter, Athens had definitively lost its dominant position. The war had not only exhausted the resources and population of many Greek cities, but it also destroyed the trust between the Poleis. The Peloponnesian War had far-reaching cultural and psychological consequences. The historian Thucydides, himself a contemporary of the war, analyzed in his great work with sober clarity the political and moral upheavals of these years, and thereby created a work that to this day is regarded as the foundation of critical historiography. The war showed how fatal the struggle for power between rival city-states could be, and how quickly a system of balance and mutual respect could turn into mistrust, violence, and destruction. Thus, the Peloponnesian War marked the bitter end of an epoch that only a few decades earlier had been characterized by a unique cultural and political flourishing. It left behind a fragmented Greece, which was soon to become the scene of new struggles for power, thereby further increasing its vulnerability to external conquests. The rise of Thebes and Sparta. After the end of the Peloponnesian War, Sparta was at first the undisputed leading power in Greece. The victory over Athens had once more confirmed Sparta's reputation as a military great power, and for a short time it seemed as though Sparta could now establish a lasting hegemony over the Greek world. Yet the conditions remained unstable. The 4th century BC became a period of constant struggles and shifting alliances, in which various polis in turn tried to seize supremacy. Greece remained fragmented and found no lasting balance, which in the long run increased its weakness against external powers. Sparta at first used its position to install oligarchic governments in many cities, which relied on the support of Spartan garrisons loyal to them. But this interference quickly aroused resistance. Many polis regarded the Spartan regime as externally imposed and authoritarian. Moreover, Sparta as a society was militarily oriented, but politically and economically not designed to administer a far-flung hegemonial structure permanently. It lacked the infrastructure to collect tribute efficiently or to organize a stable alliance system such as Athens had built up in the 5th century. The dissatisfaction with Spartan dominance soon erupted into new conflicts. Athens recovered with astonishing speed from its defeat, Only a few decades after the loss of its fleet and walls, it was once again able to rally an alliance of cities around itself, which sought to counter the renewed rise of Sparta. The most famous challenge to Sparta, however, came from Thebes, a polis in Boeotia, which until then had stood rather in the shadow of the great powers. In Thebes, a new political leadership succeeded, supported by military geniuses such as Epaminondas and Pelopidas, in openly challenging Spartan hegemony. In the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, the Thebans under Epaminondas dealt the Spartan army a crushing defeat. This was a turning point of almost revolutionary significance. For the first time, the legendary superiority of the Spartan hoplite formation was broken. The Theban phalanx, with deepened formations and an innovative battle tactic, showed that Sparta was militarily vulnerable. In the subsequent period, Thebes itself rose to become the leading power of Greece. It attempted through its own alliances and military expeditions to secure its dominance, among other things also on the Peloponnese, where it further weakened Sparta's supremacy. At the same time, Thebes pursued a policy of strengthening smaller states, for instance, through the re-establishment of destroyed Messenia, which had long suffered under Spartan oppression. Yet, Theban supremacy also proved unstable and short-lived. After the death of Epaminondas in the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BC, the Theban alliance system quickly decayed, and there emerged a new balance of power in which no polis dominated permanently. Athens again attempted to expand its position through a second naval league, but could not win the trust of many allies. Sparta was militarily weakened and socially too rigid to rise again. Thebes had lost its best generals and suffered from internal political tensions. Thus, in the 4th century, Greece remained a fragmented world of city-states which fought against one another in ever-new coalitions. This constant competition did promote cultural and military innovations, but it made the land politically vulnerable. The attention of the Greeks often remained fixed on their local rivalries, while to the north in Macedonia, under Philip II, a new power was forming, which was soon to enter the stage and fundamentally shake the old system of autonomous polis. Thus, the time of inner Greek struggles for supremacy was a chapter that politically weakened Greece, even though it once again proved how vital and ambitious the individual cities had remained. They could assume leadership roles for a short time, but were not able to create lasting unity, a problem that was to shape Greek history until the end of the classical epoch. Philosophy and science. In the 5th and 4th centuries, BC Greece, especially Athens, developed into a center of intellectual life that was to influence the foundations of European intellectual history up to the present day. In this period, philosophy and science unfolded in a depth and breadth that was unique until then and profoundly shaped the thinking of the Western world. Names such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle stand symbolically for this intellectual flowering whose effect reaches far beyond their epoch. The prerequisites for this were manifold. The polis structure of Greece, with its emphasis on citizen participation in political decisions, fostered a public discourse that went beyond mere questions of power. Popular assemblies, courts, and symposia offered spaces in which argumentation, discussion, and questioning took place. At the same time, Athens developed into an urban environment that, through trade, art, and international contacts, was rich in inspiration. Here, philosophers and scholars found not only patrons, but also an interested audience. Socrates, the best-known philosopher of this time, left behind no writings of his own. He worked through his conversations, which his pupils later set down in literary form. In Plato's dialogues, Socrates appears as a questioner and examiner, who in endless trains of thought seeks to explore concepts such as justice, virtue, or the good. His work meant a revolution. Instead of occupying himself only with natural phenomena or practical questions, he placed at the center the moral and political actions of man. He challenged his fellow citizens to question their views critically, which ultimately also brought him into conflict with Athenian society. In 399 BC, he was sentenced to death for alleged corruption of the youth and disregard for the gods, an event that was already felt in antiquity as deeply tragic. Plato, his most important pupil, adopted the method of Socratic dialogue and developed from it a comprehensive philosophical system. In his academy in Athens, the first permanent philosophical school of Europe, he examined questions of ethics, statecraft, and epistemology. His ideas of eternal and perfect archetypes, the so-called ideas, as well as his reflections on an ideal constitution of the state, belong to this day among the great foundational texts of political and philosophical reflection. Aristotle, who was himself a pupil of Plato, went in another direction. While Plato emphasized abstract principles and metaphysics, Aristotle developed a philosophy based on close observation of the world. He systematized nearly all fields of knowledge of his time: logic, physics, biology, ethics, political theory, rhetoric, and poetics. In his school, the Lyceum, he collected countless data on plants, animals, and constitutions. This connection of empiricism and rational analysis made Aristotle a founder of scientific methodology. His influence extended beyond the Roman world and medieval Arab thought into scholasticism and the early modern sciences. But Greek science was not limited to philosophy in the narrower sense. Mathematicians such as Euclid and Archimedes, physicians such as Hippocrates, and astronomers such as Aristarchus of Samos, who already suspected a heliocentric world order, built upon this intellectual climate and created foundations on which the natural sciences of the Renaissance and modernity were later constructed. This epoch made thought itself the object of investigation. The question of truth, of the good life, and of the structure of nature was no longer answered merely mythically or authoritatively, but through criticism, argumentation, and reasoning. In this way, the Greeks laid the foundation of what would later be called rational discourse, a cultural achievement that is perhaps their most enduring legacy. Thus, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are not only figures of a distant antiquity, but spirits who still accompany Europe and the world today. Their questions and insights run through Western thought. Their works are read, interpreted, and criticized again and again. In this sense, Greece of the 5th and 4th centuries BC is an intellectual homeland of Europe, whose influence reaches far beyond its political and military successes. Macedonian Hegemony. Toward the end of the 4th century BC, Macedonia appeared on the stage as a power that was to fundamentally change the political face of Greece. For a long time, Macedonia in the north of Greece had been looked down upon by the great city-states. The Macedonians were regarded as semi-barbaric highland dwellers, who took part neither in the high urban culture nor in the refined political discourse of the southern Greek Poleis. But this view changed abruptly with the rise of Philip II, a king who possessed outstanding political and military abilities and transformed the previously relatively fragmented Macedonia into a tightly organized modern monarchy. Philip, who ascended the Macedonian throne in 359 BC, at first reformed the army. He introduced the Macedonian phalanx with its especially long sarissas, spears up to 6 meters long, which enabled the infantry to outmatch opposing hoplite formations. This infantry was supported by an excellently organized cavalry. With this new tactic, the Macedonian army was both flexible and powerful. Philip skillfully employed this military superiority in order first to subdue the smaller kingdoms and tribes of the north and to secure Macedonia's borders. At the same time, Philip intervened deliberately in inner Greek politics. He played off the rivalries between Athens, Thebes, Sparta, and other cities against one another, concluded shifting alliances, fomented enmities, and offered himself as arbiter in conflicts. In this way, he gradually gained political influence over all of Greece, even before he appeared militarily. But when a coalition under the leadership of Athens and Thebes rose against him, the decisive confrontation came. In 338 BC, the Macedonian troops under Philip and his son Alexander met the united army of the Greeks at Chaeronea in Boeotia. The battle ended in a complete victory for Macedonia. The Macedonian phalanx and the heavy cavalry, personally led by Alexander, broke the ranks of the Greeks. This victory meant the end of the political independence of the Great Poleis in military terms. Philip then founded the so-called Corinthian League, an alliance of all Greek states under his leadership. Formally, each polis remained autonomous. In fact, however, Macedonia was now the hegemon of Greece. Philip proceeded shrewdly. He did not destroy the Greek institutions, but used them for his purposes. He allowed the cities to keep their constitutions and relied on their local elites, but demanded loyalty and the provision of troops for joint campaigns. His true goal was not Greece itself, but a large-scale war against the Persian Empire, with which he wished to win the Greeks for a common cause and at the same time direct their energies outward. The classical Poleis were thus to become, under Macedonian leadership, part of a larger political project. Philip's assassination in 336 BC through an attack at a festival in Aegae at first prevented the realization of his plans, but his son Alexander was to take up the work and carry it into dimensions that even Philip could hardly have foreseen. Meanwhile, the Greek polis world remained in a new role, no longer the leading force in a system of equal city-states, but part of a Macedonian-dominated league, which mobilized them for imperial aims. The Battle of Chaeronea thus marked a historical turning point. It ended the era in which Greece had been characterized by a multitude of independent poleis, which regulated their affairs in shifting alliances and hostilities. With the Macedonian hegemony began the epoch of an overarching order, in which inner Greek conflicts were no longer the measure of all things. On the one hand, it opened new possibilities, such as the large-scale campaign against Persia. But on the other hand, it also meant the end of that political freedom which had so long characterized classical Greece. It was the beginning of a new, more far-reaching world order, whose contours were soon to be finally shaped under Alexander the Great. With Alexander the Great, there appeared on the historical stage a figure whose influence radiated far beyond Greece and fundamentally changed the face of the known world in only a few years. After the assassination of his father Philip in 336 BC, the only 20-year-old Alexander ascended the Macedonian throne. What at first appeared like a risky seizure of power by a young, still inexperienced king soon revealed itself to be the beginning of a unique campaign of conquest which in less than a decade shattered the Persian Empire, united Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Persia, and reached as far as India. Alexander inherited a superbly organized army and the political groundwork of his father, who had united Greece under Macedonian leadership. From an early age, under the influence of his teacher Aristotle, he had received an education that provided him not only with knowledge of warfare, but also with an awareness of Greek culture and philosophy. Hardly secure on the throne, Alexander at once set about putting into action the long-planned campaign of vengeance against Persia, officially as retribution for the destruction of Athens during the Persian War, in reality driven by an immense ambition and the dream of glory such as had once been won by Achilles, his great role model from Homer's Iliad. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with his army and began his campaign. The first great battle at the Granicus opened his way into Asia Minor. This was followed by the decisive victories at Issus in 333 BC against the Persian great king Darius III, and finally at Gaugamela in 331 BC, where the vast Persian army was definitively broken. Alexander entered the wealthy cities of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, took immense treasures into his possession, and thus secured the financing of his vast undertaking. But Alexander sought more than mere conquest. He sought a fusion of cultures. In Egypt, he founded the city of Alexandria, which soon became a center of Greek learning and science. He adopted Persian clothing, married the Bactrian princess Roxane, and encouraged his officers likewise to marry Persian women. In many cities, he had himself worshipped as a god in the tradition of Oriental rulers, though alien to the Greeks and increasingly meeting resistance among his own soldiers. His urge to push ever further led him finally to the Indus. In the campaigns in India, he encountered cultures hitherto unknown to the Greeks, fought against powerful rulers such as Porus, and was forced to experience that his soldiers, at last exhausted, refused obedience and demanded a return. Alexander yielded and began the journey home, which led him through the desert of Gedrosia and claimed many victims. In 323 BC, Alexander died in Babylon at only 32 years of age, probably from fever, exhaustion, or the consequences of his long hardships. His sudden death plunged the vast empire into crisis. Without a clear heir, it soon broke apart into the dominions of his generals, the so-called Diadochi, who fought each other and established their own kingdoms. Nevertheless, Alexander left behind a world that was permanently transformed. His campaigns had carried the Greek language and culture far beyond their old boundaries. Cities with Greek architecture, administration, and education arose from Egypt to Central Asia. Science, art, and trade flourished in a sphere that was held together by shared cultural foundations. This process, known as Hellenism, would have been unthinkable without Alexander's conquests. Alexander himself soon became a myth. He embodied the idea of the invincible hero who amazed the world, but at the same time also that of a ruler who was destroyed by his own excess. Thus, his image was repeatedly taken up in European, Near Eastern, and Asian tradition, and transformed from a historical figure into a legendary one, which occupied poets, historians, and artists down to modern times. Hellenism. With the death of Alexander the Great began a new chapter of Greek history, which is today called Hellenism. This epoch, which lasted until about 30 BC, was characterized by the division of the vast empire of Alexander among his generals, the so-called Diadochi, and the emergence of great Hellenistic kingdoms in Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and further east as far as Bactria. At the same time, Greek culture, language, and way of life spread more widely and deeply than ever before and created a cosmopolitan world in which influences from Greece, the Near East, Persia, and Egypt intermingled. The Diadochi Wars, immediately after Alexander's death, broke apart his empire. In the end, several stable great kingdoms had emerged: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt with Alexandria as its capital, the Seleucid kingdom, which encompassed large parts of the old Persian Empire, the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia, and smaller Hellenistic states such as Pergamon or the Attalid realm. These monarchies remained mostly dynastically organized, ruled by Greek Macedonian kings who secured their power through a network of administrative centers and military strongholds. Despite the often violent struggles between these kingdoms, the epoch as a whole was marked by a remarkable cultural flourishing. Greek became the common language of communication from Egypt to Afghanistan, creating a sphere in which philosophy, science, art, and literature spread far beyond classical Greece. Cities such as Alexandria, Antioch, and Pergamon grew into huge metropolises. They became new cultural centers in which scholars, poets, and artists from all parts of the known world came together. Especially Alexandria in Egypt developed into a center of science. Under the Ptolemies, there arose the famous library, which housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls, and the museum, a kind of research institute that was open to scholars from all disciplines. Here worked mathematicians such as Euclid, who laid the foundations of geometry, and astronomers such as Aristarchus of Samos, who was one of the first to propose a heliocentric world system. In medicine, geography, and technology, too, researchers made significant advances. For example, Heron of Alexandria with his mechanical devices. The visual art of Hellenism developed a new style, which placed strong emphasis on drama, emotion, and naturalism. Sculptures such as the Laocoon group or the Nike of Samothrace testify to this drive to portray human passions and movements with striking intensity. At the same time, enormous urban complexes arose with theaters, sports facilities, sanctuaries, and palaces, which shaped the Hellenistic cityscape. Even in everyday life, the influence of this Greek-shaped mixed culture was evident. Even in faraway regions of Central Asia, coins were minted with Greek inscriptions, and Greek fashion, handicrafts, and even athletic competitions spread into areas that previously had had little contact with the Greek world. Religiously, there was a lively exchange. Egyptian, Persian, and Syrian deities were identified with Greek ones, or worshipped in Greek sanctuaries. Despite this comprehensive cultural integration, the Hellenistic world remained politically fragmented and repeatedly shaken by conflicts. Dynastic wars, struggles for thrones, and uprisings weakened the realms in the long term. This political instability was one of the reasons why Rome, which in the West developed into the leading power, was able from the 2nd century BC onward to intervene ever more strongly in the affairs of the Hellenistic states. With the defeat of Cleopatra and her ally Mark Antony against Octavian, the later Augustus, at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC and the incorporation of Egypt as a Roman province, the last great Hellenistic kingdom finally came to an end. Nevertheless, the cultural heritage of this epic lived on. The Roman world drew in literature, philosophy, art, and science on Hellenistic models, and in turn transmitted them into medieval and modern Europe. Thus, Hellenism stands for a time in which Greek culture grew far beyond its original geographical environment and, in combination with Oriental traditions, created a new, broader world. It was an epic that shaped the face of the Mediterranean and the Near East for centuries, and laid the foundations for many developments of later European and Near Eastern history. Roman supremacy. In the 2nd century BC, the political balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean fundamentally changed. While the Hellenistic kingdoms continued to rival one another and were weakened by internal conflicts, Rome in the West rose to become a new dominant force. Originally a city-state like the Greek Poleis, Rome had in the preceding centuries developed into the leading power of Italy, and after the Punic Wars with Carthage, now increasingly turned its gaze toward the Greek-influenced regions in the east. Greece and the Hellenistic world thereby came ever more under the pull of Roman expansionist policy. Direct Roman intervention began with the so-called Macedonian Wars. These conflicts were sparked by the clashes between Rome and the Macedonian king Philip V, who in the turmoil after Alexander's death had built up a significant Hellenistic kingdom in northern Greece. Rome felt threatened by his alliances, for instance, with the Seleucid king Antiochus, and intervened militarily. In several campaigns, which extended from 214 to 148 BC, the Romans defeated the Macedonians and forced them to give up their political ambitions. The decisive turning point was the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC, in which the Roman legions under Lucius Aemilius Paulus decisively defeated the Macedonian phalanx. The rigid formation of the long sarissas here proved inferior to the more flexible Roman battle tactics. Macedonia was subsequently broken up into 4 republics, placed directly under Roman authority, and a little later, after another uprising, declared a Roman province. But Roman involvement in Greece did not end there. Other Greek states also gradually lost their autonomy. Rome increasingly presented itself as arbiter in inner Greek disputes, interfered in alliances, and in this way cleverly exploited the old fragmentation of the Greeks. Many Poleis, entangled in rivalries with one another, themselves sought Roman protection, thereby giving the Republic the opportunity to expand its power step by step. Finally, in 146 BC, it came to open confrontation with the Achaean League, a last larger Greek federation that wanted to preserve its independence. After a short war, Corinth was destroyed, an admonishing example that made the Greeks unmistakably aware of the new order of power. In the same year, Rome officially declared Greece a province, Achaia. Thus, the land was now formally also part of the Roman Empire. For the Greeks, Roman supremacy meant the definitive loss of their political independence. They were now part of a much larger empire in which the local poleis could still maintain their city administrations and cultivate their cultural traditions, but in which important political and military decisions were made in Rome. Many Greek cities quickly came to terms with this new order and tried to secure advantages through loyalty. At the same time, a process of mutual cultural permeation began. While Greece was politically defeated, its culture exerted enormous fascination on the Romans. Roman aristocrats brought Greek educators and philosophers into their households, studied in Athens, and admired the works of art, which they brought to Italy in great numbers. Thus, the intellectual heritage of Greece did not merely live on in the Roman world, but was even deliberately cultivated and preserved. Roman supremacy was therefore an ambivalent chapter of Greek history. On the one hand, it meant the end of the old political freedom. On the other hand, it ensured that Greek language, education, and science were spread in a much larger sphere. Greece became an intellectual center of the Roman Empire, whose schools and libraries continued to attract philosophers, orators, and scholars who then carried their ideas into all the provinces of the empire. Greece as a province. With the year 146 BC, Greece finally entered a new epoch, After centuries of independent political development, in which poleis such as Athens, Sparta, Corinth, or Thebes determined their destinies themselves and often fought bitterly against one another, Greece now became part of the Roman Empire. After the victory over the Achaean League and the demonstrative destruction of Corinth, Rome officially declared the territories of the Greek mainland a province, Achaia. Thus, Greece was no longer merely a loose sphere of interest or an area of influence of Rome, but fully integrated into the Roman administrative and legal system. This step was the result of a longer development. Already since the Macedonian Wars, Rome had systematically expanded its position in Greece. At first, the Romans had pretended as though they wanted to secure freedom for the Greeks, had even proclaimed the freedom of the Greeks, for example after the Battle of Cynocephaly in 197 BC. In reality, however, they cleverly used inner Greek tensions and rivalries to expand their supremacy. Again and again, individual poleis or entire leagues approached the Republic with requests for Roman mediation, which Rome willingly seized upon in order to gain influence. After the last great uprising of the Achaean League, which was bloodily suppressed in 146 BC, there was no longer any doubt about who was in command. Rome established the province of Achaia, which henceforth stood under the administration of a Roman governor. Tax obligations, Roman law, and military control now belonged to everyday life. Nevertheless, much remained the same. The poleis retained their local institutions, their courts, cults, and festivals. Rome pursued a policy of integration and self-administration under overarching Roman supervision, which kept conflicts within limits. But while Greece was politically and militarily subdued, Rome was strongly influenced culturally by Hellenism. Already since the 3rd century BC, Roman nobles had traveled to Greece to be educated in rhetoric, philosophy, and art. Greek tutors and private teachers were highly sought after in the Roman upper classes. Many senators considered a journey to Athens, Delphi, or Olympia almost an indispensable part of their own education. The famous statues, paintings, and texts that came from Greece to Rome profoundly influenced architecture, literature, and even Roman religion. Especially Athens remained, even under Roman rule, an intellectual center. The city attracted philosophers of all schools. Stoics, Epicureans, Peripatetics, and academics found here their fields of activity. Roman politicians and wealthy private individuals endowed temples, libraries, and public buildings, at once an expression of their admiration for Greek culture and a means of demonstrating their own prestige. Thus, Greece, although politically dependent, became an intellectual foundation of the empire. This reciprocal relationship was also evident in literature and art. Many Romans regarded themselves as heirs of Greek traditions, adapting myths, theatrical forms, and philosophical ideas. Cicero, for example, openly referred to Greek models. Virgil reworked Homeric material, and Roman architecture adopted countless elements of Greek temple design. Greece, as the province of Achaia, thus stood for a paradoxical situation. The once proud and often so independent poleis were now incorporated into a great empire. Yet their cultural heritage lived on more strongly than ever. Greek language, education, and art in this phase even became a unifying element of the upper classes throughout the Mediterranean world. Whoever was educated spoke and read Greek, even if he came from Spain or North Africa. Thus, Greece, despite its political downfall, remained formative for the entire Roman world. It became an intellectual center of the empire, from which philosophy, science, and art set ever new impulses, which later in turn flowed into European culture of the Renaissance and modernity. Greece, as a Roman province, was therefore not merely an appendage of the empire, but an essential bearer of that culture which Rome proudly accepted as its heritage and, at the same time, as a civilizational ideal. Byzantine period. With the 4th century AD, Greece entered a new phase of its history. The political map of Europe and the Mediterranean changed fundamentally, as the vast Roman Empire came increasingly under the pressure of internal crises and external attacks. In order to make administration more efficient, the emperors eventually permanently divided the empire into a western and an eastern part. From then on, Greece belonged to the Eastern Roman Empire, which in modern times has received the name Byzantine Empire, derived from its capital Byzantium, later Constantinople. This development meant a profound change. Greece was now no longer part of a common Latin empire, but part of a realm that was increasingly oriented toward Greek language and culture. Latin remained the administrative language until the 7th century, but already in everyday life and in education, Greek dominated. For the people in Athens, Corinth, or Thessaloniki, little changed at first. The cities remained local centers, their markets, crafts, and ecclesiastical structures continued to develop. But above all, now, stood the emperor in Constantinople, who was regarded as guarantor of order and law. The Byzantine Empire adopted many structures of the Roman state, but increasingly combined them with Orthodox Christianity and a specific court culture. Already under Constantine the Great, who in 330 AD elevated Byzantium to his new capital and renamed it Constantinople, it became clear that here a center was emerging that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean for centuries. Greece thereby moved into the sphere of influence of a new power, at once Roman and Greek-shaped. Christianization played a decisive role in this period. Already since the 1st century, Christian communities had formed in Greek cities. Paul preached in Athens and Corinth, and Christianity spread throughout the entire region. With the official recognition of Christianity by Constantine, and later its elevation to the state religion, intellectual life was fundamentally transformed. Pagan temples decayed or were converted into churches. Old cults disappeared in favor of Christian liturgy, which unfolded in the Greek language. At the same time, Greece remained a core area of economic and cultural life. Its location on the sea routes between Constantinople and the western Mediterranean made the Greek cities important centers of trade and craftsmanship. Port cities such as Thessaloniki experienced lively exchange with Italy, Asia Minor, and even the Black Sea. Craft specialties such as silk production or the forging of fine metalwork also flourished in Byzantine times. Politically, Greece was closely integrated into the Byzantine administrative system, which was divided into themes, military and civil districts designed to ensure protection against external enemies. This organization became particularly important when, from the 7th century onward, Slavic groups began to penetrate the Balkan Peninsula. Byzantine armies and administrative units repeatedly had to fight against intruders or organize resettlements in order to keep the Greek coasts and urban areas under the empire's control. In the course of the Byzantine centuries, Greece thus became ever more an integral part of the Eastern Roman Empire. At the same time, the country itself decisively shaped the culture and identity of Byzantium. The Greek language definitively displaced Latin from administration and jurisdiction, and the philosophical and rhetorical heritage of classical antiquity was preserved and passed on by Byzantine scholars. Monasteries became centers of manuscript copying and theological debate, thereby preserving an important part of ancient knowledge. The belonging of Greece to the Byzantine Empire thus created a new cultural synthesis. Rome, Greek antiquity, and Orthodox Christianity united into a distinct civilization that for centuries formed the intellectual and political counterweight to the Latin West. For Greece itself, this period meant a long phase of relative stability, but also integration into a great empire, which had its intellectual and political center in Constantinople, Byzantine culture, and Orthodoxy. In the long period of the Byzantine Empire, Greece developed into one of the most important core areas of Orthodox Christianity. While the Western Roman heritage, after the fall of Rome, disintegrated into various Germanic kingdoms and the papacy emerged there as a spiritual center, Greece remained closely bound to Constantinople and the Byzantine Church. In this close connection lay a central feature of medieval Greek identity, the self-conception as part of a Christian Orthodox civilization which consciously distinguished itself from the Latin Church of the West. Byzantine culture combined the heritage of Greek antiquity with a deeply rooted Orthodox faith. Many elements of classical philosophy and science were taken up by Byzantine scholars, reinterpreted, and connected with Christian ideas. In monasteries and schools, monks copied ancient texts and thus kept alive the knowledge from Homer to Aristotle. At the same time, a rich theological literature developed in which church fathers such as John Chrysostom or the Cappadocian Fathers strove to formulate orthodox dogma. The liturgy of the Orthodox Church, which was performed largely in the Greek language, profoundly shaped religious life in Greece. Unlike in the West, where Latin dominated as the church language, Greek here remained the living medium of preaching, prayer, and hymns. Church festivals, processions, and an elaborate calendar with numerous feast days structured life in town and countryside. Icons played an outstanding role. These religious images were not merely decoration, but were regarded as windows to the divine. In Greece, important schools of icon painting emerged, which have preserved their style to this day. Byzantine architecture also deeply shaped Greece. Everywhere churches arose with characteristic domes, richly decorated mosaics, and wall paintings that depicted biblical scenes and saints. This architecture became a distinctive feature of the Orthodox world and lent even small villages a spiritual radiance. Famous examples such as the monasteries of Meteora or the churches on Mount Athos, which over the course of the Middle Ages developed into a center of Orthodox monasticism, still testify today to this close connection of landscape, architecture, and religious life. At the same time, a distinct ecclesiastical administration developed. Greece was interwoven with metropolises and bishoprics, which were subject to the Patriarch of Constantinople. The clergy played not only a religious, but also a social and often economic role, since many monasteries accumulated landholdings and supported local communities with schools, hospitals, and care for the poor. In cultural self-definition, the Greeks increasingly distinguished themselves from the Latin West, especially after the so-called Great Schism of 1054, which finally separated the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. For many Byzantines, it was clear that their empire carried the true legacy of the Roman Empire and Greek culture, but in Christian Orthodox form. This idea survived even the fall of Constantinople and lives on in Greek Orthodoxy to this day. Thus, during the Byzantine centuries, Greece was not only a part of the Eastern Roman Empire, but a spiritual core region of Orthodoxy, in which art, liturgy, and theology found a distinctive form. This spiritual wealth is still palpable today in church festivals, icons, and the Greek liturgy, and represents one of the most enduring legacies of this long epoch, Crusades and Latin rule. The Crusades, originally conceived as armed pilgrimages to the Holy Land, had profound consequences not only for the Near East, but also for Greece and the Byzantine Empire. Particularly the Fourth Crusade, proclaimed by Pope Innocent III, developed into a decisive turning point for Greek history. Instead of marching to Jerusalem, the crusading army turned against Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, and conquered it in the year 1204. This conquest was a shock to the Orthodox world and initiated a phase of so-called Latin rule, in which Western European nobles ruled over large parts of Greece. After the fall of Constantinople, the Crusaders and the Republic of Venice divided the Byzantine Empire among themselves. The so-called Latin Empire was established in Constantinople, while Western European princes founded numerous principalities, duchies, and counties in Greece. Thus arose, for example, the Duchy of Athens, which stood under Frankish rule, or the Principality of Achaia on the Peloponnese. At the same time, the Venetians secured important port cities and islands such as Crete and Euboea in order to control their trade routes in the eastern Mediterranean. This time was, for many Greeks, a phase of political and religious foreign domination. The new lords introduced the feudal system of Western European character, which in many regions led to a reorganization of property relations. The local population had to adapt to a feudal structure which had previously been unknown in this form. At the same time, the Latin rulers tried to enforce the Roman Catholic Church, which in a land deeply rooted in the Orthodox tradition often met with rejection. Churches were partly converted into Latin cathedrals, and papal envoys attempted to subordinate the Greek clergy to the Pope. Despite these interventions, the rule of the Latins was by no means stable. Many Greek noble families retained influence and reorganized their power by forming alliances with the new rulers or entering their administration. In addition, in those parts of the former Byzantine Empire that could escape conquest, Greek successor states emerged, for example, the Empire of Nicaea in Asia Minor, the Despotate of Epirus, and the Empire of Trebizond. These realms regarded themselves as the legitimate continuation of the Byzantine heritage and prepared in the long run for the reconquest of Constantinople. For the Greek population, this time was ambivalent. On the one hand, the rule of the Western princes often meant a restriction of local autonomy and religious traditions. On the other hand, the new dynastic conditions also created trade contacts and cultural influences from France, Italy, and the rest of Latin Europe. In the cities, elements of Western European knightly culture merged with Greek customs, which was reflected, for example, in architecture and court life. Finally, the Empire of Nicaea under Michael VIII Palaiologos succeeded in reconquering Constantinople in 1261. With this, the direct Latin rule over the capital ended, and the Byzantine Empire was formally restored. Yet the world had changed, the empire was weakened. Many Greek territories remained under Venetian or other Latin control, and the mistrust between Orthodox and Catholic Christianity had deepened further through the events of the Fourth Crusade and the subsequent decades. Thus, this time of the Crusades and Latin rule in Greece stands for an epoch in which the land became the stage of the clash of two Christian cultures. The Western knights brought with them their own notions of rule, feudalism, and Catholic faith, but encountered a deeply rooted Orthodox society, shaped differently in language, liturgy, and social organization. These experiences left traces that were to influence Greece's relationship with the West for a long time. Ottoman Conquest. The 15th century brought for Greece another profound turning point. After centuries of Byzantine rule, followed by a period of alternating Latin and local dynasties, a new great power now entered the stage: the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, who since the 14th century had steadily advanced into the Balkans, finally put an end to the Byzantine world. With the fall of Constantinople in 1453, not only was the capital of the Byzantine Empire conquered, but also a political and cultural era ended, one that had shaped Greece and the entire Eastern Mediterranean for over 1,000 years. The capture of Constantinople by Sultan Mehmed II was a world historical event. It cleared the way for further expansion of the Ottomans southward and westward. Even before this, Ottoman troops had subjugated large parts of Macedonia, Thessaly, and Thrace. After 1453, little by little, the remaining regions of Greece also came under Ottoman control. The Peloponnese, with its scattered principalities, Epirus, central Greece, and eventually also the Greek islands, were incorporated into the Ottoman Empire, although Venice was able to maintain its own strongholds on some islands for a long time. For many Greeks, the Ottoman conquest meant a dramatic turning point. The centuries-old Byzantine administration and the Christian imperial idea disappeared. In their place arose an Islamic-shaped empire with its own order. The Ottomans introduced their system of provinces and taimars, whereby land was granted to soldiers and officials who in return performed military service. The Greek upper class, which had previously often consisted of landed nobility or wealthy merchants, had to fit into this new system or lost its traditional position. At the same time, the Greeks retained a remarkable degree of autonomy in many areas. The Ottomans were pragmatic. They left the administration of church and many social affairs to the Orthodox Church. The ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople was given extensive powers to guide the Orthodox population spiritually and in many civil matters. Thus, the Church became the most important bearer of Greek identity in a time when there was no independent state. Nevertheless, the new rule was often burdensome for the Greeks. The payment of taxes, especially the head tax jizya, weighed heavily. Particularly drastic was the boy levy, the so-called devshirme system, in which Ottoman officials collected Christian boys in order to convert them to Islam and train them as janissaries, the elite soldiers of the Sultan. Many Greek families saw this as a painful loss, even if some of these boys later attained high positions in the empire. The cities of Greece adapted to the new circumstances. Mosques often arose in place of old churches or alongside them. Bazaars and caravanserais shaped the urban landscape. At the same time, many villages and even parts of urban life remained deeply imbued with Greek traditions. The Greek language, customs, and festivals endured, sustained by family structures and the Orthodox liturgy. The Ottoman conquest thus brought a long phase of foreign domination that was to span almost 4 centuries in Greece. Nevertheless, it also laid the foundation for a peculiar dual structure. Politically and militarily subject to the Ottoman Sultan, Greece remained strongly independent in language, religion, and many cultural practices. This peculiarity shaped the collective consciousness of the Greeks, nourished over generations the memory of the Byzantine past, and carried forward the hope of a future independent state. Altogether, the Ottoman conquest of the 15th century meant not only the political incorporation of Greece into an Islamic-ruled empire, but also the beginning of a long epoch in which Greek identity was expressed above all through ecclesiastical, linguistic, and cultural distinctiveness. This was later to become decisive for the drive toward national independence in the 19th century. Long period under the Ottomans. After the conquest of Constantinople and the gradual subjugation of all Greek territories, Greece fell for nearly 4 centuries under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. This long phase, from the 15th to the early 19th century, represented a formative period for Greek society. It meant political dependence and incorporation into an Islamically dominated empire, but at the same time, the survival of a distinct Greek culture and identity, sustained above all by the Orthodox Church and by local communities. Administratively, Greece was part of the multifaceted Ottoman state structure. The Ottomans divided their dominions into provinces and sanjaks, which were administered by governors who were accountable to the Sultan in Istanbul. Landholding was often organized within the Timar system, in which soldiers and officials were endowed with revenues from land in return for their service. This guaranteed the military strength of the empire, but also brought recurring burdens for the peasants, who had to pay taxes and dues to their local lords. The cities of Greece were transformed under Ottoman rule. Mosques, minarets, and baths shaped the cityscape, while trade and crafts were oriented toward the great markets, the bazaars, which were typical of Ottoman urban development. In port towns such as Thessaloniki, Patras, or Chania on Crete, maritime trade and a multi-ethnic society flourished, in which Greeks lived alongside Turks, Jews, Armenians, and others. Nevertheless, the overwhelming part of the Greek population remained rural and was often organized in remote mountain regions, where traditional structures were preserved for a long time. A decisive factor for the preservation of a Greek identity was the Orthodox Church. The Patriarch of Constantinople was recognized by the Sultan as head of all Orthodox Christians in the empire, and administered numerous affairs that in Europe would have been matters of the state. Marriages, inheritances, education, and poor relief fell under the responsibility of the Church. The Greek language also remained alive through the liturgy, religious sermons, and the preservation of ancient and Middle Byzantine texts. This spiritual and religious autonomy, however, was not always a protection against discrimination. Christians were considered dhimmi, that is, protégés, who were subject to the special head tax, the jizya, and had to accept certain restrictions. The often feared boy levy, the devshirme system, in which Christian boys were conscripted into the Sultan's army and trained as janissaries, was a particularly painful experience for many families, even if some of these young men later attained high positions. Despite these disadvantages, the Ottoman Empire offered relative stability and a unified legal and economic structure. Merchants, craftsmen, and farmers found predictability in this system, and wealthy Greek merchants, the phanariates, rose in Istanbul itself to become significant intermediaries between the Greek population and the Ottoman court. They led large trading companies, became interpreters and diplomats, and later played a role in the national renewal movement. For centuries in Greece, the awareness of being a distinct community was nourished. The memory of the Byzantine Empire, the cultivation of the Orthodox religion, and the maintenance of the Greek language formed the backbone of cohesion. Folk songs, legends about the Byzantine past, and stories of local uprisings against Ottoman tax collectors or soldiers kept alive the feeling of belonging to an ancient nation. The Ottoman period was, in this sense, ambivalent. It placed Greece under foreign domination, but at the same time created the conditions under which the Greek people could assert themselves as a spiritual and cultural unity. The long Ottoman rule thus not only shaped daily life and social structures, but also in its way prepared the ground for the idea of a future independent Greek state. This vision was finally to take shape in the 19th century in the Wars of Independence, Greek Uprising. The year 1821 marks a decisive turning point in the history of Greece, the beginning of the Greek War of Independence against Ottoman rule. After almost 4 centuries under the sovereignty of the sultans, the Greeks now rose openly to establish their own nation-state. This uprising was not only the result of growing discontent and national aspirations within Greece, but was also supported by a broad European movement of Philhellenes, who admired the ancient heritage of Greece and identified with the struggle for freedom. The causes of the uprising ran deep. For generations, a consciousness of their own cultural and religious identity had been preserved within Greek society. Orthodoxy played a central role, as did the memory of the Byzantine Empire and the proud tradition of the Greek language. At the same time, since the 18th century, an educated Greek upper class had emerged which, through trade and contacts with Western European cities, absorbed enlightened and humanistic ideas. Many young Greeks studied in Paris, Vienna, or Berlin and returned with the ideas of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, which brought them close to the concept of national self-determination. The uprising was organized primarily by the secret society of the Filiki Eteria, Society of Friends, founded in Odessa in 1814. Its goal was the liberation of Greece and the establishment of an independent state. The actual revolt began in March 1821 on 2 parallel fronts. On the one hand, in the Danubian principalities, where Alexandros Ypsilantis marched in with a Greek volunteer corps, and on the other hand, within Greece itself, in the Peloponnese, where local leaders and clerics called peasants to rise up. The Peloponnese, in particular, quickly became the center of the uprising. Within a short time, important Ottoman garrisons fell there, and massacres on both sides intensified the conflict. The Greeks stormed cities such as Kalamata and Tripolis, while the Ottomans in later years carried out harsh reprisals, including the cruel massacre of Chios in 1822, which caused horror across Europe and strengthened solidarity with the Greeks. Indeed, support from European Philhellenes played a significant role. In numerous countries, committees arose that collected money and weapons or sent volunteers. Poets, artists, and politicians celebrated the Greeks as descendants of classical Hellenes. Particularly well known was the British poet Lord Byron, who not only provided financial aid, but also traveled himself to Greece, where he died of fever in Missolonghi in 1824. His death made him posthumously a martyr of the Greek cause and gave the War of Independence additional moral legitimacy in Europe. The war itself was long and bloody. The Greeks fought it partly as regular campaigns, partly in the form of guerrilla actions in the mountains. Internal rivalries among the various Greek leaders repeatedly hindered unity. The Ottomans, in turn, called upon their powerful vassal Egypt for help. The Egyptian governor Muhammad Ali sent a well-equipped army under his son Ibrahim Pasha, which devastated large parts of the Peloponnese and almost brought the uprising to collapse. Only the intervention of the European great powers turned the tide. Russia, Great Britain, and France, out of different political interests but also under the pressure of public opinion in Europe, recognized that an independent Greece had to come into being. In 1827, an Allied fleet destroyed the Ottoman Egyptian navy at Navarino, cutting off the Ottoman supply lines. In the following years, the great powers exerted diplomatic and military pressure until the Ottoman Empire was finally forced to give in. Thus, the uprising of 1821 marked the beginning of a long and hard struggle that ultimately opened the way for Greece to statehood. It was sustained by a deeply rooted sense of cultural continuity, by religious cohesion, and by the European ideal of Philhellenism, which regarded Greece as the cradle of Western civilization and therefore saw its liberation as a moral duty. This combination of national striving and international sympathy made the Greek uprising one of the defining national movements of the 19th century. Independence. After nearly a decade of bloody struggle for independence against the Ottoman Empire, Greece was finally recognized in 1830 by the European great powers as an independent state. This fulfilled a long-held dream that had been nourished for generations in the villages, towns, and monasteries of Greece, the dream of liberation from Ottoman rule and the rebirth of an independent Greek state. At the same time, a new chapter began for Greece, in which it had to constitute itself politically, economically, and culturally as a modern nation. The final recognition of the independence of Greece took place in the Protocol of London in February 1830, which was signed by Great Britain, France, and Russia. Now, these three powers had already previously played a decisive role when in 1827, at the naval battle of Navarino, they decisively defeated the Ottoman Egyptian fleet and thus created the military basis for the continued existence of the Greek uprising. The London Protocol now established for the first time in binding form that Greece should be an independent kingdom, though at first with limited territory, mainly in the Peloponnese, in central Greece, and on some islands. The young nation faced enormous challenges. The long war had devastated the land, villages and towns had been burned down, agriculture lay in ruins, and large parts of the population lived in bitter poverty. At the same time, entirely new state structures had to be created. There were no established national authorities, no unified administration, and hardly any sense of a pan-Hellenic political public sphere. Rather, local leaders who had gained power and influence during the War of Independence often confronted one another with their client systems and personal interests. As the first capital of the new Greece, Nauplia on the Peloponnese was chosen, a well-fortified port city that had already been an important center during the uprising. Here resided Ioannis Kapodistrias, the first president of Greece, who came from Russian service and tried to establish a modern administrative and legal state. His reforms, however, encountered resistance from local notables and warlords who wished to preserve their traditional autonomy. Kapodistrias was assassinated in Nauplia in 1831, which clearly showed the political insecurity of the young state. In order to stabilize Greece, the European protecting powers finally decided to turn the country into a kingdom under a foreign monarch. In 1832, the Bavarian prince Otto of Wittelsbach was installed as King Otto I. In this way, the new Greece was also to receive a certain guarantee of European order and stability. Under his reign, the capital was soon moved from Nafplio to Athens, which at that time was still a small, half-ruined town, but was chosen because of its symbolic significance as heir of ancient Hellas. In Athens, an extensive reconstruction began. Neoclassical buildings arose, wide streets were laid out, and the ancient heritage was deliberately emphasized in order to illustrate continuity. The international recognition of Greece in 1830 was thus not only a diplomatic act, but also the starting point for a laborious project of national self-discovery. In the following decades, Greece had to consolidate its institutions, build a modern administration, and at the same time overcome the social contrasts between local dignitaries, the rising bourgeoisie, and a rural population that was often still shaped by traditional ways. At the same time, independence from the very beginning was linked with a certain incompleteness. Many Greeks still lived in Ottoman territories in Macedonia, Thrace, Epirus, or on Crete, which in the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries would lead to a series of further conflicts and territorial expansions. Yet the founding of the Kingdom of Greece laid the foundation for a national existence which, for the first time since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, was once again in its own hands. Thus, the centuries-old dream of liberation from Ottoman rule had at least for part of the Greeks become reality: Balkans and World Wars. The period from the Balkan Wars to the end of the Second World War was for Greece an epoch of great upheavals, territorial gains, but also profound suffering. In this phase, Greece once again became, for the first time since antiquity, a state that encompassed large parts of the historic Greek settlement areas. At the same time, the country was drawn into the turmoil of two devastating world wars, which shook it politically, economically, and socially. At the beginning of the 20th century, Greece had already partly overcome the narrow borders that had been granted to it in 1830. Yet many Greeks still lived outside the kingdom in Macedonia, Thrace, Epirus, and on the islands of the Aegean, which still belonged to the Ottoman Empire. The goal of national unification, the so-called Megali idea, remained a strong motive in Greek politics. In 1912, the First Balkan War broke out. Greece allied itself with Serbia, Bulgaria, and Montenegro in a coalition against the Ottoman Empire. In a swift campaign, the Allies were able to conquer large territories. Greece occupied Thessaloniki, Ioannina, and large parts of Macedonia, as well as Epirus. These successes, however, were soon qualified by the Second Balkan War in 1913, when Bulgaria, dissatisfied with the division of the spoils, attacked its former allies. Greece and Serbia, however, were able to hold their ground, and the Treaty of Bucharest in 1913 confirmed the Greek territorial gains. In this way, Greece almost doubled its territory and acquired important regions with a mixed population in which many Greeks lived, but also Slavs, Albanians, and Turks. Hardly consolidated, Greece was drawn into the great conflicts of the First World War. Here, the political leadership became divided. Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos wanted to enter the war on the side of the Entente, while King Constantine I, due to family ties with the German imperial house, preferred neutrality or an alliance with the Central Powers. This so-called national schism even led at times to two rival governments. Only in 1917, after the forced abdication of the king, did Greece officially enter the war. After the victory of the Entente, Greece was able to expand its position at the Paris Peace Conference and received parts of Thrace, as well as a zone around Smyrna, Izmir, in Asia Minor. Yet the attempt to occupy Asia Minor permanently and to create there a greater Greek state ended tragically. The Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922, after initial successes, led to a catastrophic defeat. The Greek troops had to retreat. Smyrna burned, and hundreds of thousands of Greeks fled or were expelled from Anatolia in the population exchange of 1923. This Asia Minor catastrophe shook Greece profoundly, but at the same time led to the country becoming more ethnically homogeneous, as many Muslims had to leave Greece. Economically and socially, however, the country was heavily burdened by the absorption of over 1 million refugees. Nevertheless, after years of hardship, it succeeded in integrating the new population groups into the state and economic system. Athens and Thessaloniki grew rapidly, new villages and districts arose, and the economy picked up again after the world economic crisis of the 1930s. With the Second World War, Greece experienced another severe tragedy. After being attacked by Italy from Albania in October 1940, Greece entered the war and at first surprised with an impressive success of resistance, driving back the Italian troops. But in April 1941 followed an invasion by German troops from the north via Bulgaria, which led to Greece being quickly occupied. During the years of occupation, the country suffered from famine, widespread destruction, and severe repressions. The loss of human life was enormous. Numerous villages were burned down, and both resistance fighters and civilians fell victim to cruel reprisals. At the same time, a broad resistance movement developed, which split into different political camps. These front lines contributed decisively to Greece sliding into a bloody civil war after liberation in 1944. But already during the occupation period, the basis for these confrontations had been laid. Communist and bourgeois groups not only fought against the occupiers, but soon also against each other. Greek Civil War. Immediately after the end of the Second World War, Greece became the scene of one of the first major conflicts that reflected the tensions between East and West in the post-war period. The Greek Civil War from 1946 to 1949 was not only an inner Greek drama, but also an early chapter of the global Cold War. It subjected the country once again to a severe trial of division and left wounds that would shape Greek society for decades. The roots of the conflict already lay in the period of occupation during the war. Under German and Italian control, a broad resistance had formed in Greece, carried above all by leftist and communist-dominated organizations. The most important of them was ELAS, the military arm of the National Liberation Front, EAM, which not only fought against the occupiers, but in large parts of the country also effectively established its own administrative structures. Alongside it existed smaller, more monarchist or conservative-oriented resistance groups, which were often in competition with EAM. After the liberation of Greece in the autumn of 1944, it quickly became apparent that the fight against the occupiers was turning into an inner Greek struggle for power. The British government, which traditionally claimed influence over Greece, supported the return of the government in exile and the king. It regarded the strong communist movement with suspicion and saw in it a potential expansion of Soviet influence into the Eastern Mediterranean. Although Stalin, in the so-called Percentages Agreement, had allocated Greece to the Western sphere of influence, and the Communist Party of Greece in fact received no direct support from Moscow, the fear of a communization of Greece remained great in the West. The tensions first erupted in fighting in Athens in December 1944, the so-called Decembriana, when British troops and the government moved against EAM Hellas. Although a ceasefire followed at first, the antagonism remained. From 1946 onward, the situation escalated again. In the mountains of northern Greece, communist guerrilla units, now calling themselves the Democratic Army of Greece, gathered and began an open uprising against the central government in Athens. This war was particularly brutal. Both sides committed massacres and deportations. Entire villages were accused of collaborating with the other side and were cleared out. The conflict gnawed at the country down to the families, separating neighbors and relatives who joined different camps. Many rural regions, especially in Epirus and Macedonia, suffered under forced recruitment, reprisals, and counterstrikes. From 1947 onward, the government troops received massive support from the United States. Within the framework of the Truman Doctrine, the United States regarded Greece as a key state whose stability was important for the containment of communism in Europe. They sent military advisors, delivered weapons, and helped to build up a tightly organized army, which was increasingly able to push back the insurgents. These, in turn, received only limited help from neighboring Yugoslavia and Albania, since Moscow largely stayed out. In 1949, the tide finally turned in favor of the government. With massive use of American equipment and with clear strategic superiority, the Greek army was able to capture the strongholds of the communist fighters in the mountains of northern Greece. Many fighters fled abroad, while those who remained were arrested or executed. Thus, the Civil War was decided militarily. The consequences of this conflict were devastating for Greece. Hundreds of thousands had been killed or injured, many villages destroyed. A large number of Greeks went into exile, often to states of the Eastern Bloc. At the same time, the country remained deeply divided. Mistrust and enmities between left-wing and right-wing family groups continued to shape the political and social climate for a long time. Political persecution, professional bans, and internment in camps for leftists cemented an authoritarian course for years, which was only gradually relaxed after decades. In this way, the Greek Civil War was one of the bloodiest internal conflicts in Europe of the 20th century, and early on became a model example of the ideological struggle between East and West. Military dictatorship. The years from 1967 to 1974 belong to the darkest chapters of modern Greek history. During this time, Greece was under the rule of a military junta that governed the country in an authoritarian manner, abolished fundamental political freedoms, and attempted through suppression, censorship, and repression to establish a conservative nationalist order. The dictatorship was an expression of the deep political tensions that had accompanied Greece for a long time after the Civil War, and only ended as a result of the dramatic events surrounding the Cyprus crisis. The path to the military dictatorship had already become apparent earlier. The political climate was highly polarized, shaped by the fear of a renewed strengthening of the left and by a monarchist conservative right that saw itself as guardian of the nation. A series of government crises and scandals in the early years, as well as the conflict between King Constantine II and the popular Prime Minister Georgios Papandreou, aggravated the situation. The elections of 1967 pointed to a possible victory of the centrists or even of leftist forces, which aroused great concern within the army. On April 21, 1967, lower-ranking officers under the leadership of Colonel Georgios Papadopoulos seized power. In a well-prepared action, they occupied strategic points in Athens, arrested hundreds of politicians, intellectuals, and potential opponents, and overnight placed the country under their control. The coup took the king himself by surprise, who at first gave the impression of accepting the new government. A later attempt by the king to overthrow the junta failed and led to his flight abroad. The military established an authoritarian regime that saw itself as the savior of the nation. They declared that Greece had to be protected from a looming communist overthrow and morally renewed. In this sense, they banned all leftist organizations, controlled the media through strict censorship, restricted the university system, and set in motion comprehensive surveillance of the population. Thousands of Greeks were arrested for political reasons, tortured, or interned in camps on remote islands. While the junta wanted to project outwardly an appearance of order and stability, resistance grew within the country, especially among students and intellectuals. The protests culminated in November 1973 with the occupation of the Polytechnic in Athens, where students barricaded themselves and demonstrated against the dictatorship. The uprising was bloodily suppressed. Tanks rolled against the university. Several people died. The images of this violence shocked many Greeks and caused international outrage. Finally, the junta collapsed due to a foreign policy crisis. The regime had tried to extend its influence to Cyprus, where a coup by Greek nationalist forces against the government of President Makarios was instigated. This provoked a military intervention by Turkey, which occupied northern Cyprus. Greece stood on the brink of war. The military lost support within its own country, and under massive pressure, the junta was overthrown. In the aftermath, Konstantinos Karamanlis, who had been brought back from exile, returned to Greece and assumed the government. Thus began the transition to democracy, the so-called Metapolitefsi. Shortly thereafter, the monarchy was abolished in a referendum. Greece became a parliamentary republic. The years of military dictatorship left deep marks. Many families were directly affected by arrests, surveillance, and intimidation. The climate of mistrust and political polarization persisted for a long time. At the same time, the bitter experience of authoritarianism led Greek society in the following decades to develop a new sensitivity for democratic values and civil liberties. The confrontation with the dictatorship, its victims and perpetrators, remained an important topic in politics, art, and public memory. Greece today. After all the dramatic upheavals, conquests, and liberations that Greece experienced over millennia, the country today is a modern European state, firmly integrated into the political and economic structures of the West. Greece is a member of the European Union, the Eurozone, and NATO. At the same time, it preserves a unique cultural heritage that has significance far beyond its national borders. Yet despite this integration, and despite its cultural appeal, Greece has been severely affected since 2009 by a financial and economic crisis whose consequences still shape the country today. Post-war development increasingly led the country into Western alliances. Already in 1952, Greece joined NATO, thus securing its place in the Western Defense Alliance in the midst of the Cold War. With EU membership in 1981, then still the European Community, came a decisive step towards Europe's economic and political integration. In 2001, Greece finally introduced the euro, which was at first celebrated as a great success and as a symbol of European equality. Membership in the EU and the Eurozone meant that Greece profited from investments, trade ties, and close cooperation in infrastructure and education programs. Many regions received EU structural funds, highways, ports, and airports were modernized. The tourism sector flourished. Millions of visitors from all over the world streamed each year to the Greek islands and to cities such as Athens, Thessaloniki, or Nafplio, attracted by archaeological sites, picturesque landscapes, and the famous Greek hospitality. At the same time, Greece saw itself as the guardian of a cultural heritage that it shared with the whole world. Ancient temples, Byzantine churches, Ottoman buildings, and a vibrant folk culture combine here into a unique mosaic. Greek cuisine, music, and traditional festivals form important pillars of national identity and have become an export article, giving Greece a sympathetic image worldwide. But the hopes that economic stability and prosperity would be permanently secured through the euro were shattered by the global financial crisis beginning in 2008. Greece slid into a severe debt crisis when it became clear that budget deficits had been concealed for years and that the competitiveness of the Greek economy had been overestimated. From 2009 onward, the country stood on the brink of insolvency and had to accept several bailout packages from the EU and the International Monetary Fund, which were tied to strict austerity measures. These years of austerity led to drastic cutbacks. Salaries and pensions were reduced, state investments curtailed, unemployment at times rose to over 25% and even higher among the youth. Many young, well-educated Greeks left the country to seek work abroad. Thus, a new wave of emigration arose, reminiscent of historical patterns, but this time depriving the country of important skilled workers. Despite all the economic hardships in recent years, Greece has undertaken cautious steps toward stabilization. The budget deficit was reduced, and the economy once again showed slight growth. Tourism also experienced a renaissance and became one of the most important pillars of the Greek economy. However, the social situation remains tense in many areas. Poverty and insecurity are still widespread. Politically, Greece has established itself as a stable parliamentary democracy. Changing governments, from conservative to left-wing coalitions, attempted to manage the crisis while at the same time securing Greece's place within the EU. After the difficult years, awareness also grew in the country of how important a solid administration, transparent institutions, and a resilient civil society are. Today, Greece, despite all its problems, is proud of its history and of its role as a cultural bridge builder. It presents itself as a country that combines antiquity, orthodoxy, and modern European lifestyle. Greece is a member of the Western Community of States, which occupies a geopolitically important position in the Eastern Mediterranean, while at the same time living out its ancient myths, festivals, and traditions that are passed on from generation to generation.